Hello, in this video, I'd just like to briefly introduce you to and explain a little bit about my website, Shingan's portal. In this video, I'm going to explain a little bit about the resources that I have on this website and how to find them. So if you're interested in Buddhism, particularly Mahayana Buddhism or Pure Land Buddhism, I think you might find some of the materials that I have on this website to be of use. So here's the homepage, Shingan's portal. And essentially, current projects, we have these three different sections. These are constantly ongoing projects. The first one are different kinds of study guides. The second are sutra translations. And then the third is Pure Land text translations. And of course, these are kind of a subset of the second project. And I'll go through these in a moment. Below that, we have publications, and essentially these are listed here in order of publication. So the first publication of a translation that I put out was The Secrets of the Tathagata, a translation of the Tathagata Guhya Sutra from about 6 years, 5 or 6 years ago. And that was followed by the King Ajatasattu Sutra, which is actually a collection of different sutras about King Ajatasattu. And both of these are available free of charge through links on my website if you click on these links. And likewise, in Praise of Infinite Light, this is a collection of verses that I published. Mostly these are verses based on the Jodo Shinshu liturgy. And some people might like this kind of liturgy and others won't. But essentially, I wanted to put the Jodo Shinshu liturgy into verse. And so I versified a lot of it and published it in this short book, which is also available for free. And you can order physical copies of all of these books as well. Then there was the Great Collection Sutra, which I published along with two other colleagues. This is not available for free at the moment, but if you'd like a free copy, feel free to email me at the contact information that you can find on this website, and I'll be able to send you a free PDF. And then continuing on, there was the Determination of the Settled Mind, which is a Pure Land text from Japan. The Avalokiteshvara Chintamani Chakra Dharani Sutra. So this is an esoteric sutra on a form of Avalokiteshvara. And then at the end of last year or the very beginning of this year, I published the second volume of the Great Collection Sutra. And then that was followed shortly after by the Chandrapradīpa Samadhi Sutra, which is also most popularly known as the Samadhi Raja Sutra. And so please feel free to browse through these. Some of these I have freely available PDFs available on the internet, and others, if you'd like a PDF copy, feel free to contact me. And here's my contact information. So that's the publication section. And then for all updates of sutras that I translate and publish on this website, you can find them all in the updates section in order of update. So sometimes there are things which are not, all of these are translations, but some of these here are pages in the reading the study guides that I'll explain in a bit. A roadmap, this is something which is still stuff that's still ongoing. And of course, all of my work on this website is basically value for value. So if you feel you receive some value from what I do, please feel free to offer something in return to help support it. And in terms of copyright, everything that I publish is on a Creative Commons license. So you're free to use it for free and share it in other forms, as long as you give attribution of where it came from and you don't try to use it for commercial purposes. So let's go to some of the other pages on this website. So the first thing, which was the original reason for creating this website, are the study guides. And all of these you can also find up here as well in the menus at the top. So in terms of the study guides, we'll just click on that. You can click down here as well. So here are the study guides. And the first series that I was working on was a series called Learning the Navagranta. So Navagranta are 9 texts which are very great importance, particularly in the Newar Buddhism of Nepal. And I thought this would make for a very good introduction to Mahayana Buddhism for most people, because these sutras really get to the core of some of the most important concepts and ideas in Mahayana Buddhism. And in fact, I think if you read them in this order from 1 to 9, you'll probably get quite an interesting, good introduction to Mahayana Buddhism. And these were created for reading groups that I'm still running on a weekly basis. And basically, if you click on one of them, for example, Prajñāpāramitā, Perfection of Wisdom, this is a reading guide for the Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 lines. And in each of these study guides, I have all of the chapters, and each time you click, for each of the chapters, if you click on them, you'll get an explanation of some of the contents. So sometimes if there are new individuals mentioned, I'll have a section on people and terms. Not all of them have these sections, but basically they'll all have all of these chapters, the guides to chapters, will have a section for what I call overall teaching. So here I try to summarize the whole chapter in 1 or 2 paragraphs. And this was all done. This is something which, of course, people these days often do with large language models. But I did all of this long before those were available. So you can rest assured that this is all done by human effort. And then a summary. And this one was imported from Google Sites Classic, so the indenting wasn't saved. But if you have a look at some of the more recent ones, you can see how these nested trees are supposed to look. For example, the Samadhi Raja introduction. Then we have a summary with a nested tree with point form and subordinate points underneath. And then sometimes I'll have some commentary, explanation, discussion on that chapter, and then discussion questions. Not all of these guides have the discussion questions, but basically if you're running a reading group, for example, about these sutras, then in the discussion section, you'll find questions that you could use to initiate or spur up a discussion in your reading group. So please feel free to use these for your own reading groups based on the Mahayana Sutras. Now, as a historic background on the development of this, it all started with the Lotus Sutra. So the Siddharma Pundarika, White Lotus of the True Dharma. This was the first reading group that I ran starting in 2016 to 2017. And so some of these are quite old, but I think they hold up. And usually the home pages for some of these guides have some explanation of the overall structure as well. So yeah, you can see the same kind of structure within each of these chapters, within the links to each of these chapters. So we have overall teaching. In this case, it's just one sentence. And then a summary and analysis with some extra notes. So each one is a little bit different, but they're meant to be helpful for reading groups. And then liturgies for opening and closing reading group sessions. This is what I personally use for opening and closing reading group sessions. A refuge verse, which I made based on I made the versified form based on the Chinese liturgy for taking refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And then usually after taking refuge, we do a 5-minute meditation session. And people are free to meditate in any way they like, recite the Nembutsu, visualize, or do just meditation on the breath, for example. And then before reading the sutra, we recite the sutra opening verse, which is said to be composed by Empress Wu. The Dharma best, wonderful, and profound is rarely found through beginningless time. Now I can see it and hear its great sound, and wish to know Buddha's meaning sublime. So this is a verse which we read to open and honor the sutra before reading it. So we don't just jump into reading it like we would a secular book. We give it some kind of worship or honor before we get into it. And then after studying, when we wrap up the reading groups, we always do a dedication of merits. So dedicating the merits to any beings who may be able to benefit from the practice and study that we just went through. So those are the study guides. And as you can see, I also have one which is coming up. I've been working on this for quite a while, and it's quite a long sutra. But it was a reading group that I did probably 3 or 4 years ago on the Mahaparinirvana Sutra. And so that's one which I will post eventually. It's still ongoing. Okay, and then we'll have a look at the next section, Sutra translations. So I think the easiest way to access these, if you're familiar with the Taishō Tripitaka numbers, is to have a look at the list in this drop-down menu. So you can see them just listed in order of number. And then ones that are translated from Sanskrit or other languages or other collections, I have at the bottom of the list. So let's have a look at the overall menu of sutra translations. So here there's an explanation. I recently restructured the order of this. So most of these are listed by their Taishō numbers. So the number will follow the letter T if it's translated from the Taishō Tripitaka, or if it corresponds to a Chinese text in the Taishō Tripitaka. But sometimes if it's a Sanskrit text with a parallel in Chinese, I'll give it with an S followed by the corresponding Taishō number. So this is something which can help to keep the structure, so I don't just list everything in a separate section. Otherwise, they're listed as S without a number. And there are some extra canonical works. So if you're familiar with the Taishō Tripitaka, the structure of this list will be familiar to you. But essentially, the idea is, or the idea behind the structuring of the Taishō Shinshu Daizokyo, which is the basis for this kind of structuring, was an idea of the historical ordering of the Buddha's sutras. So the idea was that the Agamas must be the oldest, followed by Jātakas and Avadānas, and then Prajñāpāramitā would be probably the oldest Mahayana sutras. Now, some of this idea is somewhat problematic. Some of this way of thinking is somewhat problematic and may not hold up to modern academic scrutiny, but it does help us to organize and divide the sutras in a way that's somewhat logical. So in the Agama section, we have these are non-Mahayana sutras. These are sutras that are accepted by all Buddhists, whether they practice Shravakayana Buddhism or Mahayana Buddhism. And many of these are ongoing because they're massive collections, and they're really not the focus of my own work or my own interest, but they're so essential for Buddhism that I think it would be great to have easily accessible versions on this website so that people would be able to access everything that they need related to Buddhism on this one website. That's kind of my dream. Whether that will be achieved or not, I don't know. But if we have a look, for example, at the longer Agama Sutras, these are translations from the Durga Agama. We have the original introduction. And by the way, at the beginnings of all of these translations, I usually have the translation of the title at the top. Then here on the right-hand side, the Taishō number, and then who it was translated by into Chinese and the date, and then when it was translated into English by me with the date. In this case, I started translating these in 2025. And I think I only have a couple of translations here, so we won't really bother going into those. But essentially, there's also some explanation here, but that's essentially how the Agamas are. I think the one that I have the most from is probably the connected Agamas, Samyukta Agama, which I'm translating with the Shastra commentary from the Yogacara Bhumi Shastra. So it will be kind of a unique presentation of it. So those are the Agamas. And then Jātakas and Avadānas, these are past life stories of the Buddha. So I'd like to do some more of those. Then Prajñāpāramitā, these are very essential for Mahayana Buddhism. So most of these I'm trying to translate from Xuanzang's collection, just because it's a comprehensive collection which has, it has most of the major Prajñāpāramitā Sūtras. There's a bit of a different design here, based on the indigo colored manuscripts that you can find in East Asia. And in this collection, the ones which have underlines, they have links. So those are ones which are either ongoing. So Ashtasahasraka is actually ongoing, or they're complete. So 7th to 10th assembly are complete. So you can read those on this website. So for example, if we click on Vajracchedika, we have, again, the same structure, Taishō numbers. In this case, since it's a collection, we also have to have the fascicle number, then who it was translated by, and when I translated and published it. So there's a preface for each of these, and then the actual translation. And so this is what the translations would look like usually. Thus have I heard, at one time the Bhagavan was in such and such a place, and then the sutra itself. And if you find any errors, and there are definitely errors which I miss, please let me know by email, and I'll fix those as soon as I can. And yeah, sometimes I'll put notes at the bottom, or translator's introduction at the bottom, if there are some comments to provide. Okay, so those are Prajñāpāramitā Sutras, and these are ongoing. I've had some setbacks with this because my translation memory software that I'm using for keeping track of my translations has malfunctioned. So this might be a bit challenging, but I'll keep going as much as I can. Okay, then the Avataṃsaka section. There's quite a lot in the Avataṃsaka section that has already been translated, including the Avataṃsaka Sutra, a couple of times. So I probably won't be doing much from there in anytime soon, but I would like eventually to work on that at some point. From the Ratnakūṭa section, of course, we have the first one that I published in print, which is the Secrets of the Tathagata. But in this section, also we have the Pure Land Sutras. And so here you also see that I'm providing some section divisions that are implicit within the Taishō division. So the Taishō canon puts all of the Pure Land Sutras within this collection from Taishō 360 to 373. And so I'm trying to help you to understand the structure of the Taishō canon in this way. And yeah, for Pure Land Sutras, I'll show you the Pure Land text section in a moment, but that's the Ratnakūṭa section. The Great Collection section, or Mahasamnipata, for the time being, there are print copies only, but when it's all completed, I'd like to post a digital version on this website in some form. And then the Sutra Collection section, which some people would call miscellaneous Mahayana Sutras, but there are quite a few important Mahayana Sutras in this section. So yeah, for example, Buddha Vow Sutras, Questions Sutras, Samadhi Sutras, Sutras on Dependent Origination, Names and Numbers, and miscellaneous sutras. And then the esoteric section, I'm always very interested in esoteric Buddhism and esoteric texts, although it's not my personal practice. So you can expect texts from the esoteric section to be continually added regularly to this section. And these are also divided into different sections. So these are essentially, the esoteric section are ritual texts mostly for rituals, for tantras, and very, very few of these are actually esoteric in the same way that you find esotericism in the Tibetan tradition. So you're free to openly read these, although most of them you won't be able to practice without a teacher. And many of the ingredients or practices explained within them are not possible by oneself without a teacher or without someone who has knowledge of ritual implements and practices. but you may find them interesting for reading or for study. And so there are rituals for Buddhas, like rituals towards Amita Buddha or Amida Buddha, Amitabha or Amitayas, Amitayur Jnana, and then rituals for sutras. These are kind of interesting. And some of these are very, very much, probably we would question whether some of these are actually esoteric. But like these are visualizing the 42 letters as taught within the Avataṃsaka Sutra. Then rituals for bodhisattvas. And here we have, I've just done 3 sections. So Avalokiteshvara, Mahapramardana, and Manjushri, and then Ganapati or Vinayaka. This is the Buddhist term for Ganesh, and this one is from Sanskrit. This is a nice translation, I think, from Sanskrit, and you can see the manuscript picture behind there in the heading. Yeah, and then so here's an example of a translation with translator's note and bibliography, if you'd like to look into this in more detail. And then, yeah, Vinaya. I'm not doing that much Vinaya, but I'm interested in the Mahasangika Vinaya, so I might continue with that. And then the treatise section. This is also a translation just from Sanskrit, which I did earlier this year. Sutra commentaries, Japanese esoteric section, Jodo Shinshu section, and then ancient or Dunhuang section, in addition to some extra canonical texts. So yeah, now let's have a look at the Pure Land text. So you could either click here or you could just click on that up here. So the Pure Land text translations, this is a ongoing project, where I'm trying to collate all of the Pure Land sutras that are available for the benefit of people who are interested in Pure Land Buddhism and studying it comprehensively. So firstly, translations from Sanskrit. I just have the shorter Sukhavati Vyuha. I've translated about half of the longer one, but that's still ongoing. So that would be number 2. And then most of them will be from Chinese, and then some from Japanese. But yeah, most of these are from Chinese. The Infinite Life Sutras are different versions of the longer Sukhavati Vyuha are here. And so in this case, I have to update the structure, the way that this is visualized. But essentially, how it's organized at the moment, we have my translation. And then originally, I was listing Inagaki Sensei's translations as well. And I'll explain those a bit later. But if you click on the first one, you'll see my translation, Sutra of Immeasurable Life. And then if you click on the second one, which is listed under B, you'll find the one translated by Inagaki Sensei from his defunct website, AmidaNet, which I'm in the process of reconstructing. But this one is completely reconstructed, so you can read his translation there as well. I'll explain that a bit later. And I'll put commentaries together with these. I have one commentary actually that's completed for this, which I'll post soon. And then the contemplation of the Buddha of Infinite Life or Immeasurable Life, also known as the Contemplation Sutra. So I have a translation of that one, plus the commentary by Shandao. So in this case, Shandao's commentary is very influential and very important. So I gave a lot of attention to this. And there are 4 fascicles to this one. And so if you have a look at the translation, on the other hand, you can actually see the translation with the divisions of Shandao's commentary. So if you want to read the translation alongside Shandao's commentary, together with visualizations, or rather illustrations from the illustrated sutra, you can see that on that page, the one here. And the subsections are color-coded, so hopefully it's easy to follow. But if you want to see it unannotated, you can click on number 1, where you'll just see the plain text. Okay, so that's the Contemplation Sutra. And then the Amida Sutra or Amita Sutra. I've gone back and forward with the translation of the term, but I'm actually settling down onto just using Amida because it's more common. But yeah, there's also Xuanzang's translation, for which I only have Inagaki Sensei's version at the moment, so it's listed under B. And then there are Dharani Sutras, Pure Land Dharani Sutras, Esoteric Pure Land Sutras, and treatises or commentaries on Pure Land texts. And actually, I don't have any by myself. These are all by Inagaki Sensei. And then finally, Jodo and Jodo Shinshu treatises, and then an original work by myself in Praise of Infinite Life, the liturgy text that I talked about earlier. And then I do have one translation, one modern translation from modern Japanese, a work by Takakusu Junjiro, who I think is a very interesting thinker who is often overlooked. And so here you'll find the translation of his book on from Shakyamuni Tathagata to Shinran Shonen. So yeah, those are the Pure Land text translations in that section. I also have a translation glossary or Pure Land glossary, which is actually a work in progress. I have not updated this in a while, but you probably will find it to be quite useful as is. And then, as I mentioned, before I get to the Jodo Shinshu Seiten page, I'm in the process of reconstructing AmidaNet, which was Reverend Hisao Inagaki's website, which is now defunct. So this is largely how it looked. There were some HTML features which I was not able to reconstruct. But for the time being, only Jodo Mandala, where you can see the mandalas of the three Pure Land Sutras, and Dharma Treasury, where you can see the three sutras and works by Shinran and the seven masters of Jodo Shinshu. Only those two have been completed for the time being. Okay, going back to this page, I have an alternative layout, which is based on the structure of the Jodo Shinshu Seiten, or the Jodo Shinshu canon. So here we have a structure which is actually, it's probably a bit neater than the way it's laid out in the Taishō. So we have the three Pure Land Sutras, the works of the seven patriarchs, the works of Shinran Shonen, of relation to Shinran Shonen, and then the early Shin tradition up to Zonkaku, and then the later Shin tradition, which is mainly Renyo's works and some later works. And then we have some supplementary works. Sorry, the update wasn't saved, so it's incomplete here, but there's quite a lot of works by Honen in the supplementary section, by whom we call Genku. And then, yeah, the last page listed up here is in Praise of Infinite Life, which is the liturgy page. So that's everything on Shingen's portal. So I hope that explanation, that tour, helps to orient yourself around the website. And if you have any questions or you want to submit any comments for corrections, please feel free to get in touch with me. Again, my email is down here. Okay, that's all for this video, and thank you for watching, and happy reading.